Welcome to my long circular sock making tutorial. So this is slightly different to using double pointed needles or short circular needles because it is not immediately obvious how you use a long circular needle for doing small circumference items in the round. So I'm going to show you, I have two needles here to demonstrate. This is a long circular needle, so I think it's an 120 centimeter long circular needle. And I have a 60 centimeter circular needle. The length of circular needle that you select is actually down to personal preference. I won't use a long circular needle. I like to use the 60 centimeter because I just find that 120 centimeters is too long. Some people like an 80, some people like an 100 centimeter. It really is down to your personal preference. The technique is called magic loop, and that is how you use a long circular needle for doing short circumference items in the round. And I'm going to show you that and how to combine that with sock making to make socks using magic loop. So, as with all knitting projects, we're going to start with a cast on, slip knot, and then we're going to keep going from that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a long tail cast on, and I'm going to estimate my cast on. I use one hand wrap per 10 stitches, and it's not that scientific, but it works really well for me. So I use that for double knitting and for 4-ply. And you'll just have to ignore my little special yarn bowl. It's just to stop the ball running away while I'm videoing. So after estimating my yarn, I place my yarn over my left hand so as I tie my slip knot. So I have my tail yarn and I have my working yarn that's coming from the ball. I then take my yarn and dangle it over my fingers. I then take my working yarn, I bring it down underneath my index finger, around and over the tail yarn. I then lift the tail yarn and pull through the working yarn. Easier to do than to describe, and we're going to do it again so that you can see that. So we put the yarn over your finger, you take the working yarn underneath, over the tail yarn, lift the tail and pull through the working yarn, so that creates your slip knot. You then insert your needle into the slip knot, tighten off your slip knot, and you are ready to start your cast on. So you have your tail yarn and your working yarn coming from the ball. And then you take your fingers, you pinch your thumb and your index together and put them in between your tail yarn and your working yarn. Using the other 3 fingers on your hand, you grasp the yarn from beneath and pull them out your thumb and your index to make a little bit of space. And that's the position you start in when doing a long tail cast on. So you have a loop over your thumb and a loop over your index finger. Once you have your fingers positioned correctly, you are ready to do your cast on. So we'll do this really slowly because it's tricky enough to get at the start, but once you get it, it becomes movement. So you move your needle down to the left, up between the 2 strands on your thumb, grasping the yarn. Then you take your needle to the right over to the index finger and down between the loop that's around your index finger, holding that on the needle. You come back through the loop that's around your thumb. You slip that loop off your thumb, and then you use your thumb to catch the tail yarn again and to pull that stitch tight. So we'll do that again a few more times because it takes a little while to get that right. So holding your needle in the middle, you go down to the left, up through the loop on your left on your thumb, down through the loop on your index, slip around your thumb, slip off the loop, and then pull that tight. Not quite as slow as I'd have liked to do it. We'll do that again. And then down to the left, up through the loop on your thumb, then over to the right and down between the two, in the middle of the loop on your index finger, grasping the yarn, bring it back through the loop on your thumb the other way, slipping it off and then pulling the tail yarn to tighten up your stitch. And that is how you create stitches using a long tail cast on method. Down to the left, up through the loop through the center on your thumb, over to the right, down through the loop on your index finger, through the loop on your thumb, slip it off your thumb and pull through the working yarn again. So something to be aware of here is that you don't want to make your stitches too tight on the needle. So when you're going around, you want to use quite a soft hand movement. So you go down to the left, grasp it, go around to the right, and then slowly, as you slip it off, you do not want to pull too tightly on the tail yarn. So you're trying to create a little bit of space between the stitches as opposed to the piece around the needle. Now you obviously need space around those as well to keep it loose, but it's actually in the space, it's the amount of yarn between the stitches that really dictates whether or not you have a nice loose stitch. So if we do that again, going over and grasping your yarn, coming through the thumb, letting it off the thumb, and then very slowly, and you can see that you've created quite a large stitch this time by not pulling it in too tightly. You have great control over that as well, so that is something that you will get better at as you do it. Something worth practicing is to make sure that it's still loose but not too loose. And again, if this is your first sock, that is just something that practice will get for you as you go. So we'll just do that a couple of more times, and you can see how you can control down to the left, up through the center, around to the right, down to the center, out, slipping the thumb and grasping the yarn. You can watch this in slow-mo on YouTube as well. Down to the left, up through the center, over, grasp, back through, pull out. Once you're comfortable with that, cast on the number of stitches for the size that you're making, and we'll come back then and show you how to join in the round. So I've cast on all 44 of my stitches, and we're about to start using the magic loop method. But before I do that, I'm going to cast on one extra stitch because this is how I like to join in the round. And I detail that in the PDF that goes with this tutorial, so you can see how that works. So what you do now is you get ready to convert your needle into a short needle. So you take all of your stitches and slide them off the hard needle of the circular needle onto the cable. And about halfway over, you bend over your stitches, and about halfway through, and it doesn't matter, you can change where this loop goes, is you part your stitches and pull through the cable about halfway, and you pull it through to create a loop out the back of your stitch. You can see how you have a smaller circumference that you'll be able to work once you get going. So then I take the stitches that I've separated out and I move them back onto the needles. Once you have them back onto the needles, then you can start positioning them for working in the round. It can be a little bit tight, and that's okay because this is a cast on round and it's something that you'll get used to. So the first thing you check for then is that you haven't twisted your stitches. And the way you do that is by looking at the bumps on either side. So here you can see that on one side they look the same as facing one another, and if you turn the needles over you'll be able to see the little bumps from the cast on side that were there. So it's quite obvious that they're not twisted, and that's a good sign at this point. Something else to be aware of as well with Magic Loop is that your stitches can get very tight as well, and you have to move them up and down, and the reason for that is that some of the slack goes out of the stitches and into the space between stitches when they're on the actual cable part of the needle rather than on the rigid part of the needle. And that is just, again, a feature of Magic Loop. You pull your stitches out as you pull them onto the needle, and that corrects the size of your stitches. The next thing to note from Magic Loop is that you will have the stitches that you're going to work next on your left hand needle for right hand knitters. So you're going to have that on your left hand needle, and you're going to have your working yarn at the top of your right hand needle ready to go before you join in the round. That changes slightly when you're working in the round. So what I do, and this is a quirk of how I do my joining in the round, you'll see me moving my one stitch that I cast on extra over to the other side, and I do that to make joining in the round a little bit easier. Once you have positioned your yarn and positioned your stitch on the other needle, you're ready to take the needle out of the stitches that won't be worked until the end. So you pull your needle through about halfway along the cable, so you have half of the cable at the bottom and half of the cable at the top, and then your needle is brought around and positioned to work the two stitches together. So as you're positioning your needle, you will see that it's only got part of the cable out above it, and that is just enough so that you can bring it round and insert it in to pick up those stitches. You also need to be aware of where your working yarn is because you do not want that to be in between when you do the join. So I'm now going to go back and put in the stitch marker that I forgot when I was doing this. So I'm going to put a stitch marker in to indicate the start of the round, and that's very important. And now I'm going to knit the first stitch of my round. I knit the two stitches together, and that is what secures it for working in the round. Give it a nice pull. You don't want it to be too tight, but you don't want it to be too loose either. And we talk about a little bit more about that in a minute. So you will then continue on working your rib. So do 2 knit stitches. And now at this point I pull it through, and this is slightly different to the other methods that I'm using, and the reason I'm pulling it through is because I want to avoid creating a little gap between the first and last stitches of the round. So even though I've knit them together, when I do Magic Loop I always bring them round so that it kind of eases the strain until I've started doing a couple of rounds, and then I'll move my start of round marker back to the start of the round. So this time I'm going to go in and I'm going to do a purl stitch, and you'll see that I come in from the other side of the needle as I go in. Instead of going in from the front of the cable, I come in from the top side. And the reason for that is that that makes my stitch shorter as I'm doing my purl stitches. Apologies for this piece of the video, it's not quite as clear as I would like. I will remake it. So all I'm doing at this point is I am knitting and purling my stitches in the rib. So it's a 2x2 rib. So this is a part of the sock rather than just focusing on the magic loop. And what you're doing here is it's a 2x2 rib in this sock pattern. You could be doing this in a 1x1 rib, or you could be doing a corrugated rib, depending on the sock pattern that you're doing. So I continue on knitting about half the stitches off of the left needle onto my right needle. And then we're going to get to the next feature of magic loop. So once I've knit all of the stitches from the needle, I'm then going to stop for a little second. I leave go of my needle, and then I fix my tail. Of course, make sure your yarn is positioned correctly. And then what you're going to do, before you move the needle, the stitches off the right hand needle, you're going to pull the cable through to put the stitches that are going to be knit next onto the left hand needle again. Again, as I said before, they can be a little bit tight. The reason for that just means that your stitches need to be made a little bit bigger and manipulated because they've become smaller as they've gone onto the cable. It's okay, it's a little bit tight, but again, it's something that won't be a problem once you've done your first round. So you've now positioned your marker and you're ready to go. So now you take the stitches that you've just worked and you're going to pull the needle out the top of those as well as you did previously. You're going to position the needle because the next stitch is a purl stitch. You just happen to have stopped there, and you're going to get ready to purl. And you can see how that stitch has gotten smaller and it has created a gap in them, but that will even out as you go, and you can purl that stitch. So you're working all of the stitches that you haven't worked already from your left hand needle onto your right hand needle. Here as well is don't finish your stitch on the tip of the needle. You want to make sure that you finish it onto the body of the stitch, and that's particularly important for magic loop because you want to have your stitches the correct size, otherwise you're going to have problems when you go around to the cable part of it. Now I'm going to knit my rib. So this is my 2x2 rib of my cuff of my sock. And it's this tutorial is tricky enough because you're combining the magic loop elements, if you haven't done them before, with the steps of a sock, which are actually very straightforward. It makes it look a little bit trickier than it is, but it is, if you like if you like using this method, it's one that you can use for 2x2 socks, 2 at a time socks, excuse me, and it's something that people do like, so I wanted to show it. Coming to the end of the first round of working in magic loop, I'm just going to purl the last 2 stitches, slip my marker, and then I'm going to knit the next 2 stitches of the first round just to keep the marker in position as I show you what we're doing. So I'm going to knit that stitch. I knit it through the back loop for some reason. Don't do that. And then you're ready to have a look at what we've done so far. So you can, if you pull the whole piece of the work back onto the cable, you'll be able to see that we've now created a small circumference knit in the round on our long circulars. It's not as obvious on magic loop when you're doing it what exactly it is. So now you can see, and you can check as well at this point, whether or not you've twisted your stitches as well. You can see that there is a bit of a gap there, and that is because I started the second needle of stitches on a purl. That evens out as you knit, but and this time you'll see me in the next round I'm going to change so that the first stitch of my second round is a knit stitch because it is tighter than the purl stitch. So once you've done that, I'm going to do that here now. You can see that I'm going to pull through the cable next to some knit stitches rather than by a purl stitch, so that I can tighten up that little issue that I have created there by purling into the stitch. Then you move your needle, your yarns, both sets of stitches back onto your needle, and you're going to get ready to knit the next round of rib using the magic loop technique. So make sure your tail is in the right place, make sure your working yarn is in the right place. So because my stitches are purl, I'm going to get ready to purl my next 2 stitches and purl off the next stitches for in the magic loop. So I'm going to start working those. Put it a little bit tightly there to see that I can correct that purl stitch, and then I'm going to just work in a rib. And as you'll see, for working a rib in the round, it's different to working it back and forth. So what you're doing here is you are doing 2 knit stitches on top of 2 knit stitches and 2 purl stitches on top of 2 purl stitches, and that's how you work your rib stitch in the round, which is different to working it back and forth, where they would be alternate stitches on the different rows. Then you continue down to the end of the needle again and get ready to change. So as we come to the end of the needle again, I'm just going to talk you through the changeover between needles for Magic Loop again, as it's something that it takes a little while to get. So I let go of my needle in my left hand and I pull the stitches that are going to be worked next up onto the needle. And I fix my tail as well. I'm probably going to have to cut a little bit of that off. You could also sew it in if it's bothering you. So I slip my stitches up, and again you can see there's a small bit of tightness. I then have the stitches I've just worked. I move them halfway down and I get my needle ready to knit the next stitches again. And you'll see I'm knitting the stitches this time, which means that I'm getting a better tension on those stitches than I would with a purl stitch, because you can see that the needle is closer to the cable on the right hand side. So I'm just going to finish this round and then I'm going to do the changeover again so that you can see what that looks like. It's worth seeing this a few times in Magic Loop, because it can be quite tricky and fiddly to get at the start, but it's worth the practice. So I'm coming around again now, and this time instead of I've been through this twice, and I'm happy that I'm slipping my marker, and I'm happy that my 2 stitches, I actually pull them back to be worked next to the set of stitches that are on the cable. And the reason I do that is because I want to have a knit stitch first in my needles that I'm working rather than a purl stitch. I then take the stitches to be worked next, move them onto the left needle. I then position my yarn and then I pull through the needle again on the right hand side, position it to be working, and I knit the next stitch. Getting the movement right can take a little bit of practice, so I'm going to leave you to your practice. I'm going to finish my rib and I will be back shortly to show you how to knit the leg in stocking stitch using Magic Loop. So I'm now back. I finished my rib. Well, I'm about to finish the last few stitches of my rib, so I'm just going to take those through and then we can have a look at what this looks like once you've done a number of rows of rib, and it's definitely a lot easier to manipulate once you get that. And I've lost my round marker. I'll make sure I put that back in a second. So this is what it looks like. So this is now the cuff of your sock worked using the Magic Loop technique. You can see that a lot of the gappiness is gone, because as the technique settles in and you have more stitches, it becomes much easier to manipulate as you're going around. So the next thing we're going to do is we are going to get ready to work in the round again. So before we begin that, it's worth noting that as you begin the leg, there may be a couple of considerations depending on the pattern that you're following. You may be adding markers because you want to knit a particular panel and it tells you where in the round you need to do that. You might be adding some extra stitches or taking them away if the cuff stitches and the leg stitches don't correspond. You may also be going up or down a needle size depending on whether you're doing colour work or if you're doing something else. The pattern you're following will tell you. So the pattern for this tutorial doesn't require that, so we'll just get ready for working in the Magic Loop again. We'll put the loop through about halfway through the round, pull it through and pull your stitches back up onto your needles. Get them ready to work. Now I think so make sure that it's not on the wrong side. So if it needs to be switched over because you've already flicked out your cable, let's just get that position correctly. Yes, there we go. So it's on the right hand side, so your needle is ready to work. And then you put your stitch marker back in. Don't forget that because that is important. Then get ready to work. You've your yarn, pull back and ready to go. So stocking stitch in the round is slightly different to stocking stitch back and forth. So if you're used to knitting stocking stitch back and forth, you will know that it's a row of knit stitches and a row of purl. Now if you're knitting it in the round, it is all rounds of knit stitches because you're putting all your bumps to the back anyway because of the way that you're positioning, because the front of your work is always facing you. It's always right side out for the sock, and that's just worth bearing in mind as you do the stocking stitch in the round. Now as we come up to the end of the needle, it's very similar to doing it with the rib, except that it's a little bit easier because the next stitch is guaranteed to be a knit stitch. Let go of the needle, pull it back so that the stitches that you're going to work next are on the tip of your left needle. Then again, take out your right needle, making sure your yarn is ready to work correctly, and then position it for knitting. Position it nice and tight, not too tight though, keeping a nice even tension, and then you're ready to knit again. And that is how you do stocking stitch in the round using the magic loop technique. We're going to keep on knitting until we have the right leg length. So a little tip. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to pull my needle through early. And what that allows you to do is prevent any laddering or unevenness of tension if you're always keeping the cable going through the same part of it. As long as you know where the start of round marker is, you can pull your cable through or your needles through at any point, and that helps you get more evenness of tension. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to knit my leg, and you should knit your leg depending on the pattern. So 8 inches for the 4-ply, 6 inches for the DP ends, and I will see you tomorrow for knitting the heel flap. Thank you for joining me.